Before Hawaii was annexed by the United States, it was an independent kingdom. However, in the late 19th century, it was home to a number of American adventurers and businessmen who were disproportionately Mormon. Some of these rose high up in the ranks of Hawaiian politics, like Walter M. Gibson, who became the country's prime minister, and he had some pretty grand ambitions. He looked to expand Hawaii to encompass most of Oceania, creating a Polynesian empire. This wouldn't just have included Samoa, Tonga and the likes, but he also had some plans on bringing New Guinea and even a few Indonesian islands into the empire. Plus, it seems that the Church of Latter-day Saints would have had a free hand in converting the population. This wasn't just a theoretic plan of some man in office either. He actually took some action. For instance, he sailed to Samoa, which almost brought them into a war with the German Empire, and the king, Kalakua, was also remarkably keen on the idea. So Walter M. Gibson was central to many of these plans, and he had a pretty interesting life. In the middle of the 19th century, he acquired a ship called the Flirt and tried to start running guns to Guatemala. However, the United States government caught wind of this, he fled, and then rounded the southern tip of Africa into Asia and arrived in the Dutch East Indies. He was seen as suspicious by the Dutch authorities as he brought nothing with him, and rightfully so. He began to seek out independent kingdoms and local rulers within Indonesia, hoping to possibly foment a rebellion. In his own words, "I wanted to go and see a prince who was not surrounded by the trammels of European power. I wanted to see the Malay, the ruling race of the archipelago, in its highest state of independence, and I wanted to see more of the Kubu and Gugur, the lowest of humankind in these islands or in the world. And far more than to get gold and spices, did I want to find out what were their claims to the family of man, and on what side of the line of demarcation between man and brute did they stand." He wasn't just insulting the local peoples here when describing the Kubu and Gugur, as going off his later descriptions, he was probably one of the first Westerners to see orangutans. In fact, compared to most Westerners, he was not racist at all. For instance, he wrote, "The world is not to be all Caucasian, it needs to be a contrast of stronger and weaker brethren, or the practical and the intellectual, with the sympathetic and the imaginative. The Caucasian ceases to be such within the tropics, his superiority is only a little more than oxygen, and that belongs to his temperate latitude. That man is a vulgar egotist, who exults in the accidental advantage of his greater strength over his weaker brother, and this attitude is important when it comes to his time in Hawaii." Anyway, in Indonesia he did find a potential ally in the Sultan of Jambi, and began sending letters and gifts to him. But it didn't take long for the Dutch to find out and arrest him for trying to stir up a rebellion. Now, he could well have been trying to emulate the British man James Brooke. Brooke had helped the Sultan of Brunei in crushing an uprising, and was given the title of Raja of Sarawak. This was the first of the white Rajas who ruled in Brunei until the middle of the 20th century. Plus, private American citizens were constantly setting out to take land in Central America around this time as well. William Walker, for instance, took over Nicaragua in the 1950s, and there were similar plans to take Mexico, Cuba, and going back to the 18th century, even Canada. Meanwhile, in prison, Gibson seems to have found God and then returned to the United States, where he joined the Mormons. In his diary he wrote, "While I lay in a dungeon in the island of Java, a voice said to me, 'You shall show the way to a people who shall build up a kingdom in these isles, whose lines of power shall run around the earth. My purposes of life would change from that hour.'" Then, writing to Brigham Young, the president of the Latter-day Saints, he wrote, "It is the desire of my heart to establish a center stake for all the Oceanicans. The Hawaiians rejoice in the idea. I rejoice in the hope that the fruits of my labor here will enable me to push on next season to Japan or Malaysia in company with a few intelligent Hawaiian saints." He got backing to become a missionary in the Pacific and purchased some land in Hawaii to set up a colony for Mormons there. But he wasn't the only strange foreigner in Hawaii. Another one, for instance, was Celso Ciso Moreno, an Italian who tried to sell a mysterious island in Malaysia to the Americans. The Pacific seemed to attract all of these adventurers because it was, after all, the last frontier of colonialism. All of the continents had essentially been carved up, so seizing a few Pacific islands became the main focus of many nations. Plus, Mormons had been working in Hawaii prior to Gibson's arrival, and there were some converts like Jonathan and Napila. However, in 1857 the Mormons went to war against the United States government and recalled all missionaries to help, but that's a story for another time. Gibson, however, was soon excommunicated on account of embezzlement and the likes, but there was still a growing number of Mormons, and some Hawaiian converts like Kimo Bilio and Samuel Moana travelled to Samoa to spread the word. As for Gibson, he met with some foreigners like Charles St. Julian, who had rose up in the ranks of the previous king, Kamehameha III. Charles, in fact, in the 1850s, was given the title His Majesty's Commissioner and Political Commercial Agent to the Kings, Chiefs and Rulers of the Pacific Islands, not under the protection or sovereignty of any European government. He would later go on to serve in the short-lived Kingdom of Fiji, but when the British took over, he returned to Hawaii. So Gibson was not the first to come up with these plans, but unlike past plans, he really did take some action. For instance, he bought a newspaper in 1873 and began to spread his message. For instance, in one of his editorials he wrote, "The Hawaiian state is, in all respects, fit to take upon itself the responsibility of an advisor, a referee, or a mediator in the affairs of the weaker but still independent divisions of the Polynesian race." Gaining influence and popularity, he entered politics, running as a candidate of the King's Party. This party was created because King Lunalilo died without naming an heir, so an election was called for. The King's Party successfully helped King Kalakua win the election of 1874, beating Queen Emma, the wife of a former king. In fact, afterwards the supporters of Queen Emma rioted, but were put down by the British and the Americans. So Gibson entered the House of Representatives in this party, but he may well have been a little too late to realise his dream. This is because in 1883 the British in Australia and the Germans looked to divide New Guinea, then the French took islands like Wallis and Fortuna. So Gibson protested by saying, "There is however no good reason why the islands of the South Pacific should become appendages of distant powers. Why would not their independence be as carefully guaranteed as is that of Hawaii?" He then sent letters of complaints to 26 countries over the annexation of Polynesian islands, but he was largely ignored. Yet it seems that he was able to convince the king to get on board with his plans. In the summer of 1880, the American minister in Hawaii wrote of the king, "His imagination is inflamed with the idea of gathering all the cognate races of the islands of the Pacific into a great Polynesian confederacy, over which he will reign." So in 1885, the king and Gibson organised for Minister Carter to travel to Europe to host a conference on the future of the Pacific Islands. In Gibson's words to Carter, "The main purpose of your Excellency's mission will be to make what I may term a political reconnaissance to ascertain whether Hawaii may not be recognised as eligible to take a leading part in a more complete political organisation of Central Polynesia." And there was still some hope of expansion, as some islands like Gilbert Islands, Ellis Islands and Phoenix Islands still lay unclaimed. And there was further hope in 1886 when the British responded to him by saying they would not be opposed to a scheme whereby the independence of the islands therein mentioned should be secured. However, they wouldn't actively support such a project, and added in many ifs and buts into their statement. That same year, Gibson was appointed the Prime Minister, but he was essentially the only minister of the country, taking on the titles of Minister of War, the Interior, etc. With the king, he brought back the Honolulu Rifles, built the Iolani Palace, and created a new medal to award to tribal leaders and kings who joined the Confederation. This was the Royal Order of the Star of Oceania. Also, the Honolulu Rifles were led by John Owen Dominus, who was married to the last Queen of Hawaii. Well, in their home at Washington Place you can still find a copy of his Book of Mormon. So you had a Mormon Prime Minister and a Mormon head of the army. His wife, in fact, after the Americans annexed Hawaii, travelled to Salt Lake City, and there are some people who claim that she converted to Mormonism, but this is disputed. Anyway, now Gibson as Prime Minister, he began to push for this confederation even more. So he sent John E. Bush abroad in late 1886 with gifts to King Malietoa of Samoa. Bush was welcomed in Samoa, and he promised the Samoan king a salary of $6,000 a year if he would fall under Hawaiian protection, and Malietoa was even awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Oceania. Then in February 1887, both parties held a convention to discuss entering into a political confederation. Meanwhile, back in Hawaii, Gibson had been made Secretary of the Navy, but there wasn't really a navy to speak of. So he set to change this and purchased an old British ship, put some cannons and a couple of Gatling guns on there, creating a homemade battleship. This was the Kaimiloa, and it flew a flag designed by the stepdaughter of Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson himself wrote about the ship saying, "It was from the first a scene of disaster and dilapidation. The stores were sold, the crew revolted, for a great part of the night she was in the hands of mutineers, and the secretary lay bound upon the deck." However, Gibson still successfully sent it to Samoa to further cement the possibilities of a confederation, and Gibson wrote in his diary that the crew should take possession of Necker Island and other small islands by and by. However, by now, Samoa was in a state of turmoil. Mata'afa Ioeso rose up against King Malietoa, and major powers were looking to gain influence in the country. Germany and America would eventually have their warships face off in Samoa, while the British watched on. Later on, these powers would divide Samoa between themselves, and the Germans in particular saw this Hawaiian ship as a nuisance. When the ship arrived off the coast of Samoa, they invited Malietoa on board. He at this point was losing the war and was of course more open to the idea of the Confederacy if he got Hawaiian aid. So for weeks the ship travelled around the islands, flying the Hawaiian flag, and the band played triumphant music to entice local chiefs to support the idea of a confederation. However, as Stevenson mentioned before, discipline broke down and many sailors drunkenly went ashore and disturbed the peace. Then the Germans, along with the two other powers, warned in case Hawaii should try to interfere in favour of Malietoa, the King of the Sandwich Islands would thereby enter into a state of war with us. But by now Kalakua and Gibson were becoming unpopular in Hawaii. They were accused of taking public funds to spend on their lavish projects, and even selling opium licenses. So the Hawaiian League was formed to challenge them, and they entered into an alliance with the Honolulu Rifles. The king dismissed Gibson, hoping it would keep the peace, but the militia forced the king to introduce a constitution. So the Kaimiloa was recalled, and the Pan-Polynesian dream, headed by a Mormon, came to an end. Had Gibson had his way, Hawaii would have united with Samoa, some islands like Gilbert Island, probably New Guinea, and further afield into Indonesia. However, this wasn't to be. Hawaii would later be annexed by the United States, and as I mentioned before, the exiled queen allegedly converted to Mormonism. But Mormonism still has some sway in the Pacific Islands today. For instance, Prince Atta of Tonga became a Mormon in 2015. Anyway, my question to you today is, can you think of any other planned unification movements? Some pan-religious movements or ethnic movements are obviously quite well known, like the Pan-Arab movement, but can you think of any lesser known ones? Leave yours in the comments below.